There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good. The next session will be presented by Grace Martineau. She actually used to be on the working group with myself and okay, there we go. So yeah, as I mentioned, she used to be on the working group for the conference, but she moved on a few years ago to maybe a better, good position for Grace. She's currently the acting director of housing and homelessness within AFN, and she'll be doing her presentation on the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy Update. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tansy. As Severio mentioned, I'm Grace Martineau. I'm the Director of the Housing and Homelessness Sector at the Assembly of First Nations. I am grateful to be here today. I'm very happy to be here with you today. And I acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation in the Robinson Superior Treaty area. And it's great to see such familiar faces and some new ones here. It's been a long time. This will be my second in-person appearance since the beginning of COVID. So it's really good to be here. This afternoon rather, I'm going to provide you an overview of what the Assembly of First Nations and the housing and homelessness sector is up to. So I'll give you a high-level summary of our progress on AFN's advocacy to support First Nations moving toward care and control of their housing systems, which is a key element of the First Nations National Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy. I'll also give you a summary of our work towards developing a First Nations National First Nations Homelessness Action Plan. So the AFN housing sector, we advocate for improved community well-being by implementing housing and homelessness political mandates and initiatives. So we strive to secure broad recognition of and respect for First Nations housing and homelessness rights and jurisdiction while working to improve the policies and programs and obtaining the investments required to meet for First Nations housing and homelessness needs. Our work is mandated. Our work and initiatives are mandated through First Nations in Assembly by resolution. We all know that there is a need for improved direction and AFN or First Nations-led initiatives to improve the sovereignty and autonomy of First Nations in making decisions surrounding their housing. For housing, this means comprehensive approaches that leads to closing that infrastructure gap while taking into account things such as population growth, migration back into the First Nation, climate change, resiliency, and social and economic opportunities. So the cornerstone to transformative change for First Nations across Canada is the First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy. The strategy was mandated through chiefs and our First Nations in Assembly in 2018, 2017, as well as 2018. The strategy provides a framework for long-term approaches for First Nations to transition and assume jurisdiction of housing and related infrastructure strategy. And it offers goals and actions related to governance and delivery, funding and finance, and skills and capacity and information. Detailed initiatives and outcomes relate to short, medium, and long-term. And performance measures are proposed in its implementation plan. Other work serves as a guide for First Nations to develop their own work and their own strategies in their regions and sub-regions. And we work closely with our chiefs at the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure and our regional technicians and with government on reforming First Nations housing. So much of the work that we've been doing is trying to figure out what exactly is needed in First Nations across Canada. Last year, we completed the first ever cost estimates on First Nations housing need. We had commissioned the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy to help us out with that. And it was determined at that time that an investment of $60 billion was needed for First Nations housing. And we've used these cost estimates in the 2022-23 budget submission. We didn't receive what we had asked for from the federal government, but our advocacy efforts were successful in achieving $2.3 billion, something that was quite unachievable in the past. But since our last budget submission, the most significant development of First Nations housing has been the precedent-setting AFN-led joint work with Indigenous Services Canada and to fulfill the Prime Minister's mandate to close the infrastructure gap by 2030. Which means that the gap will be, well, they're saying that they'll want the gap closed by 2030 in 7 years. It's a huge, huge task, which is almost unbelievable. So Minister Hadju has committed to that mandate and closing that infrastructure gap by 2030 and has made it one of her top 5 priorities. The AFN infrastructure sector leads the development of that budget proposal as well as the narrative. And with it, Indigenous Services will submit that to the Minister of Finance. The cost estimates and the budget proposal was built on the previous housing needs study that we completed in, I believe it was 2017. And then here in Ontario, FNHC completed that through their tribal councils and came up with some really good data that was submitted and helped come up with these housing needs. Their cost estimates report for that 60 billion was developed on those numbers. But the investment that is needed now is substantially higher than that. So we are working with some consultants, AFN and Indigenous Services Canada, on coming up with a cost estimate. But the cost estimate will include things that weren't considered in the previous cost estimate, such as capital, operations and maintenance, climate change, accessibility, and other areas not covered. So we're working with the federal officials to lay out the parameters of a new federal First Nations housing policy through a co-developed memorandum to cabinet or a shadow MC. So we're hoping that this will result in negotiated agreements with First Nations through which the federal government will provide the sufficient multi-year funding for First Nations to manage their own housing systems. We will also consider items such as policy reforms and or redesign and addressing skills and capacity issues. But continued advocacy by Chief Committee on Housing and Infrastructure and other chiefs across Canada is needed. So the AFN will support chiefs in their advocacy efforts as we go through the federal budget process or the upcoming federal budget process. I haven't been advancing my slides. I apologize. Recently, to help First Nations work towards that transfer of control, AFN graciously received $250,000 over this and next fiscal year to conduct some research. Some of that research will look at the Section 95 program and how that can be reformed and or drawn back so that there could be maybe some new programs. And we also work with CMHC on options and really complex aspects of that Section 95 program, and looking at other areas where we can improve CMHC programs. The minister or the prime minister and the minister had directed CMHC to lead the creation of a Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. It's a pan-Indigenous national strategy, and it's imperative that First Nations views and perspectives are represented. And we have to make sure that we're engaged in discussions as the federal government proceeds to develop aspects of the strategy. Our chiefs across Canada have always maintained that their responsibility to First Nations, to their citizens and members, no matter where they live. The Minister of Housing has committed $300 million to develop that strategy. So we'll work with CMHC to ensure that each region has a way to develop, to be engaged, and to come up with ways on how they see themselves within that Indigenous strategy. Other initiatives currently underway within the housing and homelessness sector. We're looking to convene a National First Nations Skills and Capacity Needs Roundtable Phase 2. A couple of years ago, we completed a feasibility analysis on the establishment of a National First Nations Housing Policy and Research Center. The Research Center, the First Nations Policy and Research Center was identified as a goal in the First Nations National Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy. We also convened a roundtable of experts, a first roundtable, and that looked at how skills and capacity is being delivered currently across Canada. And we also completed an environmental scan on skills and capacity across Canada. So these two pieces of research will help us move towards better outcomes for skills and capacity in First Nations. And because we all know how disjointed skills and capacity training programs are out there, and there's no one window approach, or there are many programs that many First Nations don't know about, and how we can access the skills and capacity. Phase 2 will look at coming out with and making some recommendations for chiefs, for the chiefs in Assembly to consider. We're also going to update our national housing needs study. So our original housing needs study that we had completed several years ago, we will look at working with our regions to update that. We are going to hold a National Housing and Homelessness Forum in February 2023 that will be held in Toronto. We're really looking forward to that. That will be our first in-person forum since the start of COVID. I remember our last forum in 2020, it was at the Royal York in Toronto, and that was when they first announced COVID was out. So we were all panicking, trying to get out of downtown Toronto. A business plan to establish a National First Nations Housing and Research Policy Center. This is the second part of that feasibility study that I had mentioned. And as well, on our cost estimates report that identified the 60 billion was needed for housing, we also asked for a preliminary framework in looking at housing performance for First Nations. So what does that look like as far as performance measurement goes? What are the indicators? What does good housing program mean to First Nations? What does a house mean? What is a good house? We want to look at all those aspects. So we've hired again the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy to help us come up with a framework on performance measurement indicators for First Nations housing. But it'll be a framework that First Nations can use to build their own frameworks and to meet their own housing needs and how they see housing in their First Nation. We're hoping that it'll be used by government when they look at their performance measures. And we also provide support to the Dene Nation up in the Northwest Territories. As you know, their circumstances are a little bit different in that they're not under the Indian Act, but they're First Nations nonetheless. Homelessness. A few years ago, the First Nations in Assembly mandated the Assembly of First Nations to develop a national action plan on homelessness on and off reserve. So this action plan will look at improvements to First Nations housing and infrastructure, along with critical investments in social services to reduce First Nations homelessness. We know that many individuals and their families in our communities are, by some definition, homeless because they have no choice but to live with their families or couch surf or in somebody's backyard or anywhere, or in an overcrowded home, many of which are low quality or could possibly pose some mental or health risk. The majority of homelessness Indigenous people in urban centers are First Nations citizens, many of whom have migrated away from their First Nations because they don't have anywhere to live. And they don't have access to the services that they require. So the National Action Plan on First Nations homelessness will advocate for a multi-partner approach and solutions to First Nations homelessness. And it'll be comprehensive and holistic and will align with the National First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Strategy. Because as I've indicated, chiefs maintain that they are responsible for their citizens no matter where they live. I'm not sure why this isn't advancing. The homelessness action plan will also have a few considerations. And one of them is to determine the number of First Nations people experiencing homelessness. With that, that is a hard task, as we know, because how do you do a homelessness point in time count in a First Nation community? We don't know. We don't know how to do that. And I don't know if it can be done. We want to analyze data to determine the causes and the gaps in services, including the shortage of housing on reserve that contributes to members leaving their communities, and the reasons that prevent the homeless from accessing adequate shelter on and off reserve, and develop mechanisms to allow First Nations to access data collected in their own future, for their own future use. And some of the research projects that we have completed to date, we've completed a literature review on First Nations homelessness, an environmental scan, and a systems map. We worked with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness on completing these. We've also completed we've completed 16 engagement sessions with our regions, technicians, and service providers who provided input into and their views on First Nations homelessness. And we've also completed a homelessness survey, and that was distributed through our chiefs and our distribution lists, as well as through social media, and when it was posted on our website. And we received, I think, just under 1,000 surveys. Some of the upcoming research projects are actually their research projects that are underway. A cost estimate on First Nations homelessness. So we don't know what it's going to cost to eliminate or reduce First Nations homelessness. And we don't know what the cost is if we don't do anything at all. So we're going to, we are embarking through a request for proposals on coming up with some cost estimates. And those cost estimates will help us with our budget submissions in the future. And we will use those cost estimates in other advocacy. We're also, yes, sorry. Mm-hmm. Mhm. We did actually speak with people who had firsthand experience with homelessness. That was our first phase of engagements, because we needed to learn about First Nations homelessness because we didn't really know what it was. We know what a person is to see them out on the streets, but what does a First Nation homelessness person mean? And what does it mean to a First Nation? That was the first part of our engagement sessions. Now that we've done all the background work, we're going to take it back to for more engagements to see how we can start building the action plan and how First Nations see themselves in that action plan. So yes, the lived experience, in my view, those are the ones that know. Yeah. Thank you. The homelessness data collection tool, another project underway to develop a tool that will help gather First Nations homelessness counts. It's not going to be a tool to use point in time counts, but it'll be a tool that First Nations can use to collect data in their First Nation. We're working with Help Seeker, who also helped us with the systems map to come up with a methodology and a design on what this tool should look like and what it should incorporate. We'll work with a design team of people who know firsthand on how homelessness is delivered and what the homelessness population consists of in First Nations. So we're hoping that this will help First Nations as well as help us at the national level collect data on First Nations homelessness, because we don't have First Nations homelessness data. Our First Nations data are incorporated into Indigenous point in time counts. Reaching home distinctions-based funding. Right now, the Homelessness Policy Directorate at Infrastructure Canada has a program called Reaching Home that provides funding to service delivery organizations across Canada. They do have an Indigenous stream, but they don't have a stream for First Nations. So First Nations proper, so First Nations who I just say on reserve, aren't eligible to apply underneath that program to help with their homelessness needs. So we're working with the Homelessness Policy Directorate on this distinctions-based aspect. So they've given, they're allowing 12.3 million for this year, so that First Nations can apply for access to that funding and use it for their own needs under the Reaching Home program. So we're hoping that it'll be a little more there'll be some more flexibilities than what we've seen in other programs. And the chief's technicians have indicated they want a more regional approach. So we're going to work with our regions who will work within that region or sub-regions to access those dollars. The original amount is 27 million. So there's a good chance that this could be extended for a couple of years. So what we're hoping for the outcome or the result is that they'll use this as, and the outcomes of this for future programs such as this. But we're hoping for more, is that there should be a First Nations led and develop, our First Nations led developed program, not necessarily reaching home. So we'll keep you posted on that, and more news on that will be on our website. And that concludes my updates for now. Keenan Escombe well. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you. Questions?
You mentioned that there was the chiefs have stated that the need to provide for citizens regardless of the debt. I'm curious, within the budget that you had put forward to the federal government, was there inclusion for urban or specifically probably off-reserve housing?
No, that was just for on-reserve housing.
That's something that might be in scope at some point?
It could very well be. Mm-hmm. Yes. Any other questions? Hi.
I'm from the Yukon, and you were talking about AFN and all these monies. How does Yukon First Nations fit into all of this? Because I know there's only a regional, a woman that represents AFN in the Yukon. And because we are First Nations, that's where I'm from, the Yukon. We have never settled our self-government and with Canada. And we also, there's 14 First Nations in the Yukon, and we're one of them that hasn't signed. And for me, AFN just seems to recognize the 11 First Nations that have signed. And I don't know how it works, but I feel that way.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion on it. So how do the Yukon, how do we access all this money? How could we access this money? Is it through that lady who represents AFN for Yukon region?
So are you speaking about the funding, the 12.3 million for homelessness?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're working with the Yukon, and your First Nation is absolutely eligible for sure. And we don't forget about the First Nations who aren't recognized under the Indian Act. When we at the Assembly of First Nations, when we say First Nations, we mean all First Nations.
Yeah, I know, I understand that, and we do, and for my First Nations, we do follow federal procedures because we do follow, we're under the Indian Act.
Oh, well,
regardless
yeah.
of how we're looked at, because we haven't signed our self-governing agreement with Canada or the Yukon. So I just want to put that out there.
Well, we work with the AFN, we're with the AFN region in Yukon. So the regional chief out of that office, that's who the technician and the regional chief.
I know, I say that is because that the representative for the Yukon really doesn't upgrade or update all First Nations in the Yukon on how does AFN work and all these things. So I think
Yeah,
maybe we can go back and suggest that she start communicating with Yukon First Nations because she's representing us at this level.
yes,
But I
yeah.
really don't understand some of your guys' policies and procedures when it comes to housing initiatives.
So the policies and procedures for the regional chiefs, those are their policies and procedures, and I would not tell a regional chief what to do by any means. But there is a responsibility of the technician to update their chiefs on that. I mean, it's the responsibility of the regional chief as well to update all of their chiefs.
Yeah, I understand
Yeah.
that, but you
Yeah,
know, it just feels like the Yukon is being left out for
Yeah, I'm
many
sorry to hear
years.
that. Yeah.
I said, it just feels like the
Yeah.
Yukon region has been left out on a national level for many
Yeah,
years.
I'm sorry to hear that for sure. You know
I'm
what?
just pointing out
Yeah.
my opinion and my concern,
Yeah,
and
I
I
appreciate
think
that.
that I have a right to have that say.
Absolutely, you do.
So I just
I
like to thank
appreciate it.
you. Yep.
Thank you. Mhm. Any more questions?
Not a question, but
Mhm.
wow. Not a question, but maybe a comment. My name is Rod Hill. I'm with BC Housing. And one of the things that we had done was commission a study of the housing shortfall on reserve in British Columbia. And that study showed roughly every community is 50% smaller than it needs to be, or it needs to increase in size by 50%. And that's more pronounced in remote special access communities where most need to double to meet the demands of citizens for housing. But part of the reason why we put that study together was to advocate both with our provincial treasury boards, but also when our provincial ministers and whomever else meet federally to ensure that there's a level of advocacy there. So my comment would be to really everyone in the room and also to AFN in general, that if you can find aligned provincial organizations to do similar studies to step into the space of advocacy, then it might help with each province's urban homelessness issues and challenges, but can help advocate for First Nations to ensure that the funding is there to support the additional infrastructure and housing that's required to meet the citizens' needs. So just want to put that on the table for everybody.
Thank you. More questions? Okay, again, I thank you. Kinanas continuo.
On behalf of this is loud. On behalf of the organizing working group, we'd like to thank Grace for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have
It's on? Okay, here we go. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. The next session is the success stories, and that starts directly after this, actually about 5 minutes from now in the ballroom 2 and 3. So if you can just make your way there after, there's just a transitional break, not a health break. And please fill out the workshop evaluations, and someone should be here to give you a punch. I have one for the passport to prizes, so you can just come see me afterwards. And just one last note, the 340 to 425 First Nations Housing or Housing Community Annual General Meeting is not happening. So we are bumping up the closing ceremonies to 340. So just a note, the closing ceremonies will be at 340 in ballroom 2 and 3. Thank you.